Welcome to a small, medium, at large podcast. I'm your host, Gail Heisen, bringing you intimate interviews beyond normal boundaries. I want to thank you, all our listeners, for liking, sharing, commenting, and sticking with us as we have over 70 shows now filled with interesting characters from all walks of life. I also want to thank my daughter Nancy and my son Richard, because without them, I would not have these shows produced and posted. So thank you for all the work they do for me. They're wonderful. So let's welcome our special guest here today. Let me tell you something about her. Our guest today is Heidi Jurka. She lives by transformation and embracing change as it comes. She's been a professional psychic, a California Institute of America trained executive chef, a writer, and much more. Growing up on Croton on Hudson, New York, she credits her diverse community for curiosity about other cultures, planets, and love of travel. She has taken classes in comedy improv, crystal singing bowl sessions, and painting, which sustained Heidi during challenging times. She's tending to her organic garden at her farm in the majestic Blue Ridge Mountains, which deepens her love of this earth and renews her optimism that major positive change is still possible. Heidi Jurka is featured in the documentary film about Dr. Andrija Puharich called Mind Traveler. Her newly released book, The Making of a Psychic, has been the culmination of a life lived fully, with stories of being Andrija Puharich's research assistant and her travels and adventures to 22 countries. Let's welcome
Mhm.
Heidi today from the Blue Ridge Mountains. Hi, Heidi.
Hi there, Gail. Nice to meet you.
It's wonderful to meet you also. And I want to thank, is it our friend Sean McNamara who put us together?
That's right.
Well, I want to thank him very much. He had a very good intuitive match on this because as I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book, there were so many instances where I felt like you and I had lived similar lives growing up. So I want to thank a shout out to Sean McNamara and thank you for putting Heidi and I together. I want to begin with what I do with all of my guests, which is if you could talk a little bit about your childhood growing up in upstate, it was upstate New York. And was there anything during that time that helped you or guided you to be on the psychic spiritual path that you have been on?
Well, I was very fortunate to grow up in Croton-on-Hudson. It's only an hour from New York City, north, on one of the widest points of the Hudson River. It's 3.5 miles across on the river, so it's incredibly beautiful. And I, uh, we had a nice little house that I could see the river very far away. But we always had a garden, and our yard was ringed with lilac trees. And so I found nature in particular to be just so fascinating else, and that gave me a real start. Um, my parents were involved in many different things, but nature was a big part of it. Bird sanctuary, that kind of thing. And so I feel that's the baseline where I got my sturdiness in terms of being attached to being on the planet here, because there was so much diversity and it was so beautiful. And I tried to focus on that and not kind of on the noise and drama that people created for themselves. I found real solace in nature.
So you had a good connection with nature and animals as you were a child growing up.
Yeah.
And how about your parents? Were they into psychic phenomena or paranormal spirituality or any of these kind of things?
Actually, the opposite. We didn't go to church or anything when I was a kid. My mother was vehement. She was raised Catholic and resented it and the, sexism and all that stuff accompanied it. And she was determined that she was not going to have the fear of God struck into her children. So Sunday morning was breakfast at home and the New York Times and going over to see grandma and that kind of thing. And I never missed it. I saw people confused about the church life and all that kind of stuff. Now, everybody's got their own spiritual path. It's not anything wrong about going to church. It just didn't resonate with me. And
Mhm.
back then, of course, women's role in all these things was very confined. So as a model, it didn't do much for me. So I just wasn't in that kind of group. I was a Girl Scout. That was more my thing.
So
Uh,
I
yeah.
got the cooking badge.
Later, yes.
So did
So
you
go
have
ahead.
any childhood psychic experiences or out of body or dreaming or any things like this that made you feel different than others or made you feel that maybe there is a different path that you're going to be going on, or how was that for you?
Very early on, I had a lot of experiences with nature. In my book, I chronicled that, I would play with the neighborhood boys and we play cowboys and Indians like everybody else. And I was always the Indian because I was the girl. And I got sick of it. And I said, I don't want to play this anymore. And they were like, well, what do you want to play? And I said, let's get really small and run around inside that apple tree leaf. Because I was used to going out and being suspended, my body being suspended and having my consciousness run around out there. And I thought that's what everybody did. Didn't occur to me that that would be weird. And I loved it. I could get really tiny and climb up the rose, thorns with like handles on the rose bushes, and just really experience all that in a very vibrant way. And I didn't know that that was not the norm. And so I, early on felt like a freak, and I was careful about hiding that. But I always had seeing things. I saw energies around people early on, which we call auras now. Back then, there was no one to talk to about this.
Yes.
And so I was kind of on my own, and I would get flashes of what people were doing. Like one girl, I had this flash of seeing her up in an attic with an old photograph album. And I thought, oh, okay, well, I tried not to linger. I didn't want to invade anyone's privacy. And then the next day in school, I overheard her talking about being up in the attic and finding an old photograph album. And I was like, whoa. So, I kind of didn't know what to make of it. But I also dealt with alcoholism in my family. And
Mhm.
so that put me on guard a bit. And when I would come home to that, I would walk down the street towards my house and I would sort of size up what the energy was in the house. And so I learned to discern these things as a survival mechanism. I didn't feel like I was going to be hurt or anything. My parents never hit me or any of that kind of thing. Um, but it became a way to sense things as a mode of protection, but also it was just natural. And like I said, I thought everybody could do these things. I started seeing weak energy around people. I could tell when they were kind of ill. I would see brown, what I call the brown spots. And I just observed. I didn't go up and say, hey, I see a brown spot on you. Not like that at all. If anything, it made me much quieter and shyer and more observant. Um, and eventually that, kind of blossomed and progressed. I did note people that had weak energy, and I had one or two people in our community that passed away early. And of course, I don't take credit for that or anything. It's just I just saw that they didn't seem well tethered. And so when that happened, I was like, oh, okay, that kind of thing.
I just whatever comfort we can give each other. I had the very similar experiences, and especially the one of sort of feeling like the odd one out that didn't know till later that other people didn't have dreams like that or see things like that.
Right.
So that's why I find it such a beautiful thing through this podcast or whichever ways it is to connect with similar like minded experiences that we can share now openly. And I wished when I was 15, there was someone like each of us to talk to. I am, anyways, I have complete compassion and understanding about what you're saying. So where as those things were happening for you, was there any experiences or things that was like pivotal that put you on to the future path of what you ended up doing, which was going into the psychic and spiritual realms?
Well, definitely. After the summer of fourth grade, we went to Florida on a vacation. They plan, they like to save up money and take a good 2-week vacation in the summer. And we planned it, my mother planned it. We went to Florida and we went to what was called Santini's, which was one of the first marine parks ever. This is way before it became a thing. It was this little mom and pop place, but they had the dolphins from the Flipper movies.
Ah, I love
And
that.
they were penned up in offshore. There weren't like tubs and tanks for them or anything else. And they performed for the group. There were about 25 of us sitting on bleachers, and they'd retrieve things and they do all the twists and jumps like, you see on TV. But at the end of it, Mr. Santini scanned the crowd and he said, "Who here would like to swim with Susie today?" And it was just this hush. And from the back, my mother piped up, "We would." And so I was just like flabbergasted. Long story short, my sister and I were both picked to swim with the dolphin. And when it was my turn, I got in and Susie swam up next to me. And of course, she looked huge. I was 10 years old. Here's big smile of teeth, And as I grabbed onto her fin and pulled off, I didn't have a very good grip. And so I lost my grip on her. And she immediately used tiny muscles to position herself back and wait for me. She was so tuned in on me. It was unbelievable. I'd never experienced anything like that. And I grabbed her fin, but then I felt her connect with me and she could feel me and sense me so completely that as she swam off, she kept her body maybe 2 inches farther away from me so she wouldn't hit my legs, because that's how I lost my grip the first time. And we went around the whole thing, and just every time I thought to myself, "Oh, I'd like to go over there," we went. It's like she was totally clued in on me telepathically. And so gently, and the water rippled. I mean, it was so scenic. It was unbelievable. And that was a kind of communication I had no experience with before, but it was so validating. I just was, when I got out, I had to just sit there on the bleacher for a minute and just ponder it, because it was not like anything that I'd ever experienced. And that made me realize there was some other way to communicate. That was pure telepathy. This was an animal who couldn't say, "Hey, Heidi, are you okay?" It was all upstairs, and it opened my whole world up. And then when I was in 8th grade, now of course I couldn't tell anybody about what I was experiencing, because I would seem like a complete freak. I was in 8th grade, and they were droning on. The teacher was droning on about barometric pressure and all this stuff, and there was a bookcase in the classroom. And so I just kind of had, looking through it, and I picked up this book about this man called Edgar Cayce. And I didn't know what Edgar Cayce was, but I kind of looked at it and I was like, wow, this sounds interesting. I took it home and it blew my mind. Because here was someone who had some of the same experiences I did, and they were validated. I mean, he was actually admired for this stuff, and he was called as psychic. And I was like, oh, wow, there's a name for this. This is, like, junior high school, this is happening. And back then, this is the 60s. This was not a common thing. So that made a big difference. It was very validating. Like, no, you're not crazy. There is somebody who does this. People do this. They're not all over the place, but this is a thing.
Yes.
So I was like, okay. And that was so reassuring.
And also, those are very good seeds that were planted for the future adult things you were going to do in your 20s.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I would like to move us up to that. So we're leaving childhood now. We're going into your 20s, and you're doing all kinds of discoveries and courses and different things. And you get involved in something called MindLink. And
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
that is. And was this a positive experience for you? And what did you learn about in Mind Link?
Well, the mind link was actually later on, after I moved back to New York and was working with Dr. Puharich. In
Ah,
my 20s, I moved to California to go to college.
oh,
And I went to a psychic fair. I saw an ad for one in the newspaper, and I had no idea what that was, but it sounded kind
mhm.
of cool. So I went, and it was at this place in Anaheim called Cyanetics, which was a metaphysical school back in the early 70s.
Does
And they
that
had,
this today, or did that just?
no, it's gone now. It's people that it's still there, but it's run by other people. I think it's like a regular church.
Okay.
Cyanetics is not there anymore, but it was so cutting edge, and I made a lot of really good friends there. And they had this psychic fair, and I had readings of tarot cards, and she, tuned in that I really should. Good thing, were you, how did you get here? And I said, well, I just read it in the paper. It seemed like something I should do. And she gave me an incredible reading and told me, yeah, there's a reason you're here. And we have a youth group and we have classes and everything else. So why don't you, talk to these people? So long story short, I became part of that gang and became friends with people. And we had all kinds of psychic development classes,
Hmm.
everything from tarot to mediumship and all kinds of things. And I did very well with all of them, but I did not particularly want to be a medium. I didn't, because of the, growing up in an alcoholic home and all that, I needed more control. And I didn't like the idea of just letting an entity in. I would talk to them over there, but I would let them take over. And
Right.
that is just how I've always been. Um, so I just got
So
really involved in that. And we had, this was also when Uri Geller was first in the United States. We're talking early 70s here.
that's what I
And
was
of
wondering.
course, he was on Carson and didn't do well on that, but he did an incredible job on a show in England that November, where kids were watching that on the BBC and all kinds of stuff happened in their homes, spoon bending, all kinds, watches starting, all that stuff. And so
And
we would say,
is the man that you worked with, Andrija Puharich, is he the man responsible for bringing Uri Geller here to the United States? Is that correct?
that's correct. But of course, I didn't know that back then. We're talking about when I was like 22 or whatever. So
Mhm.
I became a working psychic. I started doing tarot card readings and got, little cards made up and psychometry or whatever, and doing healing work with that group. And that was a really great base, because we started bending spoons and doing all kinds of stuff. In fact, I have some spoons here if you want to see them. Um, and then one morning, I woke up early. I sat bolt upright in bed, and this message came to me. It's time to move back to New York. And I was like, what? I don't want to move back to New York. I got this great little studio on the beach, and I'm in Newport Beach. I've got my friends. I worked at a bookstore, which was wonderful. I love that. And it wouldn't go away. It wouldn't go away. It wouldn't go away. So I talked to my friend Sharon, who is my psychic friend from the Cyanetics days. And she said, yeah, I see you going. I'm not sure what's there. So I called my parents and said, I'm getting this, that I'm supposed to come back. And they said, okay. So I just tore my apartment apart, threw everything in my little Honda Civic, and took off and was back within 10 days.
Would it be fair to say that it was the inner voice inside you that was guiding you to leave California and move back to New York?
Absolutely. Because of the way it came, I was used to, getting that information. It came in a certain way, particularly behind my left eye. If it came in a certain way, it was more like a portal rather than a thought. The way
Mhm.
that it came in just such an assured, calm way. There wasn't any emotion attached to it. It was very pure. And I was training enough with psychic work to recognize that's when a lot of my most valid information came that way. So I listened to it. And my father was a dentist, and Dr. Andrija Puharich was a patient of his. And so he used to come home and say, oh, Andrea was in, he had all these amazing stories. And then when Uri came, of course, that made it even more so. And I had been back about not even 10 days, and Dad came home and said, Andre's going to start doing classes at his house about all this incredible metaphysical stuff. And I was like, okay. And so we all started going to these classes, and they were incredible.
And that was all you had, and this was up in Ossining, or?
Yeah, Saucony, New York, which
So
was
that
close
was
to where I grew up.
really kind of an odd place for some kind of a current. I mean, the only thing I associated with is Sing Sing prison, so I didn't think of it as a
Right.
place.
Actually, a
You know, if you
beautiful town.
San Francisco or LA or something, but who would imagine that this was going on over there?
Right.
So
Well, that, an hour north of the city still had quite a cultural thing going on. A lot of people, a lot of people just went to the city. It was a commuter town. You could get there in an hour on the train or a boat drive. So
mhm.
there was a lot going on up there, actually. They didn't make a big fuss about it.
So this is, you're getting to meet this man because of your dad and because of you thinking, I better go back to New York. So a whole nother path
Yeah,
is going to be up here for you. So tell me,
right.
first of all, before, for some of our listeners, including myself, I did not know much about Andrija Puharich until reading your book and then talking to my friend Russell about him because he was a very dear friend of him as well. So could you tell our listeners first who this man was and what he was known for?
Well, he authored 3 books, first of all. He authored a book called The Sacred Mushroom, which is about the studies they did a long time ago on the psychedelic mushrooms, but he did it in a very scientific way. He was, foremost, he was a physicist. That was his thing. He was a MD, he was a medical doctor, but he really liked analyzing these things. And he was an inventor. When he died, he had, I think, 62 patents. He was, not just a woo-woo guy who contemplated his navel. This was somebody who was very into it. And then he wrote a book called Beyond Telepathy, which is a classic and people still refer to today. And then when he found out about Uri and brought him to the US, he wrote a book about Uri. That was the first book ever written about Uri. And that kind of put him on the map with a whole different crowd. And he just found himself very interested in parapsychology, and that's what he became known for. And in fact, Jeffrey Mishlove worked with him when he was quite young. A lot of the people from back those days, if you mention his name, they know him. Not as many these days. And of course, he's died in 95, so it's been a while since he's been in the news, as it were.
There's a question I have here about that. 2 questions. One, as I understand it, he passed away in he was staying at the home of the wealthy Reynolds family. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, after the Mind Link, we went to Devotion, which was where Josh Reynolds lived. That's where that big family estate was. And Josh Reynolds was very spiritual. He wanted to start, he had Sufi dancers there at one point. When we went down, there were Sufis there. And we wanted to start a community down there, a metaphysical community, and had all kinds of plans to do that. And that didn't happen because we ended up doing other things. We went to Mexico to study the psychic sword in Pachita and all these things, and then of course the fire. And then in his later years, Andrea did live there. And then Josh Reynolds died before Andrea did, and apparently they hadn't made provisions for them, so they were asked to leave. But before that happened, Andrea died, and there's all this, gossip about how he died. I don't think he was pushed down the stairs. I think he just died. That's my
And
opinion.
the name, was that his wife who was with him then when he passed, or?
No, he was married 4 times, I think in the end, he had kind of a caretaker person that took care of him. He had diabetes and other things. A lot of this is in the biography his second wife wrote called Memories of a Maverick, which is a wonderful book and will tell you all kinds of things about him. In fact, here's a copy of it right here.
Can you hold it up a little higher? Perfect. Oh, great. And that's a picture of him on the front, I assume.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And this book is fantastic. It's no longer in print. However, if you go to urigeller.com, Uri Geller's website, and you click on the books button and scroll down, you can read this book for free, the whole thing. And that answers a whole bunch of questions because this guy had an incredible life. He did so many different things that for me to try to explain it, I couldn't do it justice. I knew him really well for 3 years, and this man had an incredible life. So I really recommend it, and it's well written too. Very, very captivating.
Well, I have three questions here or maybe four, that involve things about him, and also some information I wanted to share. But I wanted to talk about a little bit, if you could just explain what your work was with him, and if you could talk a little bit about the fire, which was life-changing for you, and the fact that if these couple who hadn't come to visit at that moment to that building at that time, it feels to me like a higher force sent them to go there to save all of you, from when I'm reading the book. If you could just highlight what that whole experience was like working for Andrija, and what you were discovering about your own psychic abilities in working and assisting with him.
Sure. Well, first, of course, the classes were happening and we were riveted for those. Basically the physics of things like dematerialization and the chakra system and what you could do. I mean, levitation, you name it. We talked about it. And he also, of course, was very concerned. He was a Nikola Tesla expert. And he was very concerned about ELF waves and the fact that Tesla had been reticent to release what he knew about them because he was afraid what would happen because they were dangerous. And Andrija was very concerned about what the Russians were doing with them way back when in the 70s, using them to change the weather patterns all over the world and giving themselves the best growing season they'd ever had and making it harder for others. But when I first started with Andrija, we had all these different classes about the soul and just how our bodies work too, because he was a medical doctor, and really the physics of it. It would be difficult for me to use the language he did. And a lot of that's in Memories of a Maverick. If you want to read it, the technical part of it, I wouldn't articulate that well. And it was a really long time ago now. But anyway, I had always been a writer, and he was writing two books. He was writing a book called TMT, Tesla Magnifying Transmitter, which was about the Tesla work in particular. And then he was writing another book called Time No Longer, which was about what he called the space kids, the psychic kids that he worked with. And after what happened with Uri, he cultivated these parents were reaching out to Andrija going, my kid can do this now and can stop watches and all this stuff. And so he started studying these kids because he found out that there were a lot more young people like this that could do what Uri could do, maybe not as flashy and all that. And when I was in Cyanetics in California, we had that. We had a 13-year-old who could do incredible things with spoon bending. So he really was interested in studying all this. And he wanted to present it in a way that made a lot of sense and that was highly documented. He was not the kind of person who was trying to draw attention to himself, like, look at me, I can do all these things and I'm, the big deal. No, his glory was presenting it in a way that could be understood, and documentation beats conversation. That's what he wanted. He was a scientist at heart. And so he was trying to find common parameters. For example, Faraday cage work. When he worked with what he called the space kids, all the psychic kids, he had a loose protocol that he used in the Faraday cage. And the Faraday cage, of course, is a copper-lined room that screens out electrical impulses. So you could have a little radio on in there, And if you shut the door, the connection would be lost. It would be quiet, that kind of thing. That's a simple way of putting it. And so he worked with all these kids to find out what their strengths were. So he went from Uri and then he expanded it. And he was also working with the psychic surgeon in Mexico named Pachita, who could do psychic surgeries quite like Arago. Now, Arago was a psychic healer from Brazil, and there was a book written about him quite a long time ago called Surgeon with a Rusty Knife by John Fuller. And that was back in the early 70s or even the 60s. And Andrija was a co-writer on that thing and studied him. And so he found that fascinating. But then Arago died in a car accident. And so he was about to bring Arago to the United States when that happened. And so he found Pachita, but Pachita was not ready to come out and did not want to be photographed and all that kind of stuff very much. But she changed her mind and finally decided that she was getting older and she wanted to share this and maybe teach other people how to do this. So, of course, that was candy for Andrija, because to be able to document all this and have all the naysayers say, well, here it is, because he was adventurous. He took on controversial subjects, but in his heart, he wanted to explain it. He wasn't, dazzled by it. He was into the physics of it.
Yes.
And that was always what it was about, and also trying to help the planet. He really felt that we were in trouble here, and he wanted to make sure that we could somehow, as a group, change things for the better. And so part of the whole thing with working with the space kids, etc., was setting up special meditations, because these kids could bend metal and everything, but they could also raise the vibration of the planet to some degree. And that was the idea, was to stop war. And I'm generalizing a big deal here. I mean, I'm not giving the specifics of the actual things that were done. And so that's where the mind link came from. And that was a very important part for me. We were preparing for this massive event the first summer that I started working with him. And by the way, while I helped him with the writing, with the books and stuff, because I had a history of as a reporter and all that, I started talking about my own psychic experiences. Like, I had my car keys dematerialized when I was in California, and all kinds of weird stuff happened. And the more I talked to him about it, we'd stop and have tea breaks, and he kept asking me all these questions. And he was like, well, I think we should do some Faraday cage work, Heidi. So I had my own sessions with him, and he determined that, in fact, I met the protocol as a space kid. So that doesn't mean you're from outer space. That just means that you have these different abilities, and you are able to expand your consciousness to a point where you can interact with others in a different way. So I helped him plan and organize the Mind Link. And we had 30 people come, and people come from all over the world. And we had a week where we did vigorous yoga, 2 hours of yoga every morning. We were really in training and doing these specific meditation protocols that built on each other. And the last one at the end of the week, the big one, as it were, was this massive thing we did to raise consciousness around the planet. We had groups all over the world, smaller groups that we tied in with, to lift the vibrations so that we would have a tangible effect that people could, document wherever they were, kind of thing. And to use that as a pilot to build on that to help save the planet, basically, create a more peaceful environment and have a place people could go to and tune in on that in order to help the planet.
And was the idea that the future kind of idea would be that there would be communities like this around the United States where people would be like-minded doing this kind of positive energy work? Was that part of that?
Yes, and there were already. It's just there were pockets. And we wanted to be able to, he wanted to be able to document it in a vibrational sense too, because of the different hertz. The thing about the ELF stuff was there were also positive levels that were like what a yogi who was meditating would go to. So, depending on what you did with it, it could be a positive thing. And so he was focused on that, not using it as a weapon.
Right.
And so that was the plan. That was the pilot that we succeeded in doing. And we got really good feedback from people all over the world that in one particular area in the Middle East, we smoothed out all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, things like that. But of course, this is back in the day before cell phones and computers. We're talking 1977.
Yes.
So the communication style was not instant. So, I'm bringing all these things up, but it's not like I can give you a printout.
There's a couple on this topic that I want to go back to before I move any more forward, which is, did you ever meet this famous psychic surgeon, Pachita? And did you ever see, I've just seen film footages on psychic surgery in the Philippines. That's all I've ever seen. And I've also seen the ones where they fake it with, chicken blood and other things. But from what I was reading in your book, it sounded like a very successful thing. And I was wondering if you could talk about this in the specifics of that woman with the kidney. Were you there for that?
Yes. I need to adjust one of my Venetian blinds very quickly. So if you could stop for 1 second. Sure.
So tell us.
Go ahead.
Yes, Pachita.
After the mind link, Andrija went back down to Mexico to confer with Pachita, and he actually had his own surgery then. He had some kind of ear spongy growth type of thing. I don't remember the technical name for it. And she operated on him first, because he would never let anybody do anything to any of his people unless they did something on him first. And he was having this hearing issue, and she took a knife and stuck it in his ear and did the deed. And at first he said it hurt a little bit, but then there was no bleeding or anything. And within 2 weeks, his hearing was totally back to normal. So, that was that. And she had finally decided to come out and teach people what she knew. She had an incredible history. She was an orphan who grew up in the circus, and she started with circus animals, healing them. And there's quite a bit on her on the web now. And so when he came back from Mexico, he had decided that we were going to fix up the house and sell it. I moved to Mexico to study her full time because she was getting older and she wanted to teach other people how to do this. So I went down there with my friend Jaime Del Rio, who was one of the space kids, and he was at the Mind Link, and he worked with energy devices, and Andrija had worked with him a few years before. So we drove down together. We became good pals. His family was from Mexico City, and Pachita was in Mexico City also. And so we came to the place we were staying, and we got, settled and all that. But pretty soon, one of the people from the Mind Link, and who's also well known for L&L research, she's a medium, her name is Carla Ruckert, she came down and she had a surgery with Pachita. Carla had always had a lot of kidney problems, and she was having big issues with them, and one of them had failed and the other one was starting to go, and she was looking at dialysis. And of course, she lived in Louisville, Kentucky. She had all this documented with her doctors. And so she came down, and Pachita looked at her and looked her over, and she would just scan people, it was any big deal. These things were done very quickly. Said that she needed a new kidney. She needed new kidneys, and that she needed a transplant, and that they were going to get a kidney from a cadaver to use in her surgery. Now that sounds outlandish, and like, how do you get a cadaver kidney? But back then in Mexico, Pachita was well known, and she did all these surgeries, and she didn't charge anything. It was donation kind of thing. So she was helping people. So there wasn't that stigma.
Yes.
Long story short, they got a kidney, and Carla was operated on. Now Andrija was in the room. He was trying to videotape these in infrared. So it was really tight. So I was not in the room at the time, but I did see other surgeries. But I was outside waiting for Carla when she was done, and she was in there less than half an hour. Made 2 incisions on her back and cut the kidney in half and and Andrea was holding the halves of the kidney, and they just sort of got sucked into her body. Yeah. And yeah, and it was amazing the things she could do. And then everyone was the same. There was hardly any bleeding. She would wrap the person in gauze and then in white sheets, clean white sheets, and they would come out and lie on the floor in this hacienda. And for about 2 hours, they said to have a rest. And I sat with her all that time, and Jaime helped interpret and got us water and all those kinds of things. But there were like a dozen other people who had had surgeries, and people came from all over the world with last case scenario issues, brain tumors, withered limbs, you name it.
Did your friend feel the pain or any kind of experience that she said to you when you were sitting by her side, like I could feel the hand going in me, or anything that she felt?
She said she felt the incision, but and there was some pain, but it wasn't the type where you'd be screaming. And she was just kind of in a relaxed state anyway. And because she was used to tuning in herself, she had some control over that, I think, to some degree. But it happened so quickly. I mean, it was boom, in and out. And everyone got wrapped in the white sheets. And I, in my books, talk about how it looked like a bunch of mummies all wrapped in white, laid out on the floor in this hacienda. It was just bizarre. And so I just hung out with her and I held her hand and talked to her. And they said, don't really move for 2 hours. And at the end of that, we went back to where we were all staying. And within a couple of days, they said, okay, don't wash or take the bandage off for 5 days. And so I'm going to move over here a little bit. When she went back to Louisville, they went back home right away after a day or two. When they took the bandage off, all that was left was little cat scratch, little railroad track, like a scar. And she was immediately so much better. She didn't have to get up 9 times to go to the bathroom every night. She got better immediately, and each day she was better and better and better and better. And finally, she, within 2 weeks or even closer, I think she was absolutely fine. But the main thing was she had doctors. She went back to her doctors, and they did not know what to do because this woman had 2 brand new, perfectly functioning kidneys. I lost track of Carla for 20 years after the fire and everything, and we finally reconnected. And I said, Carla, it's been 20 years. I got to ask you, how about your kidneys? And she said, well, I've got other health things going on, but I've never had any trouble with my kidneys since. Pachita really did heal me.
What an amazing story and woman. And I fully believe you when you're sharing this. Was she able to teach others before she passed on? Or is there anyone carrying tradition? Or is it something from so long ago you don't really know anything about what happened to her?
Well, that's kind of the sad part. Andrea was going to sell the house in New York and move there to study her. And then the fire happened and he went. And this was all the fire was in August of 78. And he went back down there again and was still going to try and work with her. And then that spring, she died. Pachita died.
Oh.
That was another door that closed.
And she was like 81 or something, is that
Yeah,
correct?
81.
So she lived just a long life helping others.
Yeah, and like again, Andrea was interested in studying her. He didn't want to become her necessarily. That wasn't his strength. He wanted to bring all this information forward for the masses, for it to be used for good, for everyone.
Yeah.
So
I spoke to Russell about him. He was saying to me what a brilliant, brilliant man he was, and that he created so many amazing he worked like with medical electronic things or something.
oh yeah.
Saying something about he had devised some very special hearing aid to help people. And I wasn't sure if you knew about that, or did it end up being sold on the market, or do you know, was that able to be manufactured? where you do something, he figured out something about little bones in the ear, and he knew what to do to then do something to affect it so that the people would be able to hear again.
Yes, he devised a hearing aid that you could put in a tooth.
In a tooth?
Yeah.
I've got a space right here, ready to get one.
And unfortunately, there's a lot of drama around that. Some of that is in Memories of a Maverick. I got a lot of good information from that book because a lot of this is before my time. And he was working with someone and they were going to develop it, and he had patent for it, and they were off to the races. And then the guy said, well, I own the patent now. I'm shutting this down. This is never going to be made.
Oh, no. Oh, that's so sad.
Yeah, that's what I heard. And I saw a video of someone who knew him very well talking about that actual incident. And I won't get into that because that's a conversation that it's not to be made public, but yeah.
Well, I have to go back to the same scenes that we're talking about right now, which is the fire. Because my image leaping out of a third-story building
Right.
and way, I was shocked. So I was wondering if you could tell what this, just the story of the fire. The people can read the full details when they read your book. I don't want to give away everything, but I had a question regarding it, which was, what did happen with all the papers and things that you were able to retrieve the day after the fire? And were you able to save, some of the history of the work that was being done there?
Well, that's the interesting part. I woke up and someone was screaming my name, and Don Elkins was the person who was doing that, and he was actually the partner to Carlo, who had the kidney transplant. They were L&L research. They were mediums. They had a lot of UFO stuff. They were in the mine link. They were very important people anyway in their own right. And he was visiting. He was a pilot for Eastern Airlines. And he and Jaime, the guy I went to Mexico with, had gone out for breakfast early, and they were going to buy a new watch band for Don. But all of a sudden, they just looked at each other and got up and drove right back to the house. And when they drove in the driveway, the house, there's smoke pouring out of the windows and no one out on the lawn. So they figured out that we must all still be in the house.
Sleeping.
Yeah.
And so what then occurred?
They started yelling. Jaime went around the back of the house to wake up the people on the second floor, and Don started screaming my name. And I woke up and groggy and all that. And I made an attempt to go down the inner stairs, but that was clearly not going to work. Plus, we found out later the gas was very toxic. It was meant to kill. And eventually I jumped out the window and I landed on the porch and whacked my neck really good. And to this day, I have to go to acupuncture and chiropractor and all that for that all the time. Swimming really helps. But I got out, and the fire marshal said that I had about 15 minutes of air left. So, as I say in my book, I was saved by telepathy.
Yes.
There's no other explanation.
No, if they had been 15 minutes later or said, oh, nah, let's have some more, let's order some more food, or
Let's go get that watch band, yeah.
and then you and the other people residing in there could have died from smoke inhalations before you could even get out.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been the flames, it would have been the smoke, and that was intentional. They turned on the gas jets on the stove. It was a professional arson done by two people in broad daylight at 9:30 in the morning. And there was a big thing about it, and the fire marshal said all these things, someone who is trying to kill you, what? We just had the mind link here. We're like, all about good stuff. Why would that happen? So yeah, there's a lot to that. And there's a film coming out about him later this year called Mind Traveler. And a lot of that'll be in there. I'm in that film as well.
Can you tell us or our listeners about when or where they'd be able to find the film in the future when it comes out? Like, is it a Netflix or any idea?
I don't have that information yet. I think that isn't completely settled. It will be streamed though, as most documentary. It's a documentary about Andrea's life, and most of those don't make it to movie theaters in general documentaries. So
Right.
yeah, I don't have that information.
And
They've
this
had
is,
certain delays and stuff, but it looks like it's getting there. I'm not in the loop.
and
So
but the year it's planned to be released is 2024.
hopefully, yeah, it looks good for that. So we'll see.
Great, and congratulations on being part of that.
Well, it was a tough decision because I've laid low in many ways under the wire ever since that happened to me. I never found out who tried to kill me. You know, I was 24 years old and, you know, meditating for peace, and all of a sudden I'm a target and no one was ever charged
Mhm.
for it and all that. So,
Well,
uh,
I asked my friend about that, and he said when he spoke to Andrea, that Andrea had felt that it was the CIA trying to send a message or some sort of CIA involvement. And that's what he said he felt. That's what Andrea felt was the reason that the fire had occurred. I'm not sure if you heard any kind of information like that as well. But apparently, I also found out from my friend that Andrea had been a foreign technology spy for the CIA for Russia, and that they saw all the documentations with his name on these. So that in fact, he said that the CIA was not spying on him, but that he was spying for the CIA. So I don't know. These are all, I'm just passing on information I just happened to hear today. And I wasn't sure whether that was the reasons you felt like you had to be in hiding, or if you felt that you had to stop doing any psychic work, or did that end your involvement in the paranormal for many years before you moved into the things that you're doing today?
well, as I chronicle in my book, it was quite a journey. I was traumatized by this event, as you might imagine. There were no answers. Um,
Yes.
Andrea went underground for a while. The intent of the fire was to intimidate him. They knew he was not home. Andrea was in Mexico when the fire was lit. And what was eventually came out was he was trying to get people to read his book TMT about Tesla, because our government did not have a program to deal with the ELF waves the Russians were using to mess with people, and not just weather patterns. This is like the Havana syndrome kind of stuff,
Mhm.
um,
Was
aimed at people.
so did that make people sick, or what was the?
Yes, it made people very sick, and it's
Mhm.
still going on. Um, and Andre was screaming and yelling about it. That, you know, the Russians are doing this. We have to have a program, and we weren't ready. And they kept saying, we're not ready. Stop and all that. And he kept trying to inform people about it. And what I was told was this was a way to get him to be under their control. And the idea was to burn down his house, kill all of his assistants, and destroy all his research. And then no one would work with him again, and that he would be under their thumb.
Mhm.
But that's not how it worked out. So the firemen got there fast enough and put the fire out. It was mostly on the first floor, and everything on the research and everything was on the second floor. So it got a nice sooty cover on all the file cabinets, because remember, this is for computers, but it
Right.
all got saved. So
Well, that was a good blessing.
yeah, yeah. So, you say, oh, meditation, well, something happened there, and we all lived through it, except for the dog. The dog was let inside, and the dog was killed by the smoke. That was intentional on the part of the arsonists. So, and there's all kinds of talk about who those people were. So
Well, they have to read your book, and they'll have to watch the forthcoming movie and read The Maverick, and they'll find all the pieces.
most of them, yeah, most of them.
Uh,
We were told it was IRA mercenaries. eventually. So that worked for the CIA. You know, I have no proof of these things myself. All I know is someone tried to kill me and that it affected my life very deeply. And
And
I had to start over.
you were a young woman, weren't you like 24 years old then or something?
24. Yeah.
And
So
so, all right, so is there any, I think we can move on from this. Is there anything else you want to say about that period in your life before we go into what the current period is?
just that at one point I didn't want to be psychic anymore.
Mhm.
And I was living in New York City and I got overstimulated by all the stimulation of New York, the noise, the people, the getting sexually harassed on the street by, you know, creeps, all of it, you know, I was there for 8 years and I became more and more kind of overstimulated by it and wanted to get out of it. And so I had a couple of things happen that made me not want to be psychic anymore. And, you know, was at one point, you know, railing in my apartment, take this away. I don't want this anymore. You know, what good is this? It's just bringing me misery. And so the chapter in my book that concerns that is called, I'd like to return this gift, please. I don't want this anymore. I want to be normal.
I truly understand because I myself at a certain point in life. And I'm
Yes.
to meet Dean Radin and Russell Targ, and that was when I decided, okay, I'll do this again.
Yeah,
So,
well, for me, it was my mother became ill, and I moved home back to Croton to take care of her while she died. And back then, there weren't a lot of formal hospice organizations or anything yet. This was, you know, in the late 80s at this point. And it took her just about a year. She'd had heart issues most of her life, and then she overdid it in the garden one day, and they did a valve replacement. But I think she had a small stroke on the operating table, and then kind of went downhill from that. At first, when I first got there, I got her in better shape, you know, because I was feeding her from the garden and taking care of her and all that stuff. But it became clear that she was going to go. Yeah. And so I got back into it because I found the whole experience of watching someone die, I don't mean that in a morbid sense, fascinating from a spiritual standpoint. So I started meditating with her again, and I could tune in on sort of where she was headed and why that was pleasing to her, why she was letting go. It wasn't scary and terrifying or any of these things. You know, it was really something that she felt was better.
yeah,
And so I was able to sort of tune in on that, and it made me get back into meditation and all those things. And I eventually later on did become a hospice volunteer myself and used the singing bowls to work with them. So that was the beginning of my reintegration back into all that.
I had a
And
friend who sat with her mother, and I think this is the most beautiful teachings is a mother and daughter being together during the dying process. That
yeah,
just that they share and the closeness. And it, you know, and some people die consciously. Not all people die where they're not speaking. There's some people that are totally with it. They finish talking and they just die right that second. So her mother in her dying process, and she was in her late 90s, told her daughter, just make sure to tell everyone you don't go towards the light. She said, when you see the light, go through it, and then you'll be on the other side. And I thought, what a beautiful thing to share on your dying last words, to share with others, and you know, dying consciously. And it sounds like the experience with your mother was enough for you to really be catapulted back into the part of yourself that really was important to keep working with, which is your psychic self that you were shutting down for a while.
yeah, that's really true. And I was so clear that I came in this incarnation to help, to be a helper. And so that woke that back up in me.
Mhm.
I got a lot out of the experience too.
Oh,
And
yes.
so uh, from then I decided that I didn't want to, I had been pursued a singing career in New York and all these other things. Didn't want to do any of that anymore. And I'd always enjoyed cooking, and I took care of my mom and fed her from the garden. Both my parents, my dad was still working. So I decided to become a chef. And I was very fortunate because the Culinary Institute of America, which is a big, prestigious, big deal chef school, was only an hour north of me in New York. It was an hour north. And I took the tour, and long story short, I went there and learned how to be a hot deal chef. I was focused on fine dining. So I worked at the swanky places and enjoyed all that. And moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and lived there. And there I really embraced my psychic and spiritual life again. That's a very tuned in town in general.
It's built on crystals, I think. It's all the quartz crystals in the ground there.
Yeah, and it just has a long history of it. And of course, there's many Native American communities there too. And so they have that whole history and a respect for the earth and that kind of thing. So, and Taos is there, and I joined a meditation group and started once again going back and doing all that. And we had a weekly meeting where the minister who did it was a medium, and he'd give messages, and then we practiced. And then this woman came one day who was part of our group, and she brought the singing bowls with her. And I've never had such an experience. Now, this is in the mid-90s when I bought mine, and that's a long time ago now.
Yes.
And her name was Ashana, and she's a big deal in the singing bowl world now. She performs and has wonderful albums out and everything else. But I was kind of there when she first started, and I had such a profound experience with them that I had to find out more. And so that led me back into the work. And I started focusing on doing healing work and all that kind of stuff. I wasn't really interested in tarot card readings and doing that kind of stuff anymore. I mean, and plus, the good thing about now is there's so much out there about all this. I don't feel I need to do any of that anymore. There's plenty of people that want to do that and do it well. So I'm retired from all that. Now I'm reintegrating into all that. And I wrote my book, and the movie's coming out, and it's kind of full circle.
Yes.
And as it should be at this point in my life. And so I'm looking forward to just being with my tribe. The Monroe Institute's about a 4-hour drive for me, and I love going there. They have such wonderful programs. I've been there several times, and taken MC Squared with Joe Gallenberger, which is the telekinesis one. And I went to Las Vegas for his Inner Vegas thing, where you do telekinesis on the crap tables with the dice and do it for, what's that?
Did you say his name again? Who is it that you studied?
Oh, his name is Joe Gallenberger. Okay. And he's one of the people that teaches at Monroe, but he also has his own classes. And he's been on Mishlov's show many times.
Have you done telekinesis yourself?
Yes, I have. Let's see.
Participate in an experiment with that, and I have to set up this whole device with a spiral paper and things for this physicist, and I don't know if I can do that because I've never really tried, and I was wondering if there's
get away from the sun here.
Info you can give me, because I'm starting this next week.
Oh, wow. Oh, here's a couple of old ones from the old days.
Oh, here. Oh, wait, here we're showing off. Here's my first one I did at an herb.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
I've got this one. It looks like you're going like this. These are from a long time ago. I just found them.
I had on one of my podcasts, I had Donna Ribadow, and she can turn them over so many times. So that's one of hers that we did on the show.
I watched that show, and I was at Monroe in the same class as her with Joe Gallenberger taking MC Squared together. Sean put it together. We were in the same group. It was before COVID, so I was having trouble remembering that far back because so much has gone on. So yes, and I remember her as being very quiet in the beginning, but boy, all of a sudden she took off and she could bend like crazy.
And she had never known that she could do such a thing, and I have never met a bender like her. I mean, the amount she's done.
Trying to get away from the sun. There.
You're good, right? And I went out to meet her and Sean McNamara because my podcast is opening up all new friends for me in my life. And I want to make the connections not just virtually. I want to be able to touch them. So we
Right.
had a wonderful time together. But when we went out to eat, we were in a Mexican restaurant and I'm sitting across from her and she's going, "Oh, it's starting. I can't help it." She did not even touch the fork. And the fork tines were bending while we're sitting there and she's trying to hide it so that the waitress doesn't, because she needs another fork now, because she can't use the one that just bent on its own. So she just cracked me up, but I had never seen, I've done my bending, but it's not my talent or my easy gift or whatever.
Right.
Woman, it's a talent. She's making the most beautiful jewelry now out of
Oh,
the
nice.
unbelievable artistic pieces. And if the person has bent the spoon or fork, they can send it to her and she'll turn it into some beautiful piece of jewelry for them. And what a wonderful way to remember doing something that special. So is there anything you could tell me about telekinesis or how it's done?
Well, it's focusing in on the energy of the fork itself and just getting in resonance with it and then sort of suggesting that it melt or turn shape. I used to be kind of a telekinesis snob. I thought it was very important that you did not touch them, that you had to be able to do it without touching them. Because otherwise, I looked at it as a type of hypnosis, like people do with, what do you call it? Pendulums. Yeah, pendulums, that it's actually their finger muscles that are making the pendulum do what it's doing. It's not telekinesis. And I felt the same way, that when people get into these states, it's almost a hypnotic state. And their muscles in their fingers and stuff are actually pushing and have this kind of superhuman strength to bend the forks and stuff at that time. Now, there are people that don't do it that way.
Well,
But I was always very critical of that process where people are, if you get a hypnotic state, you're going to be a Superman and you're going to be able to do that very easily and think that you did it telekinesis wise, when in fact you did it with your muscles. So
must be by muscles. My fork and spoon thing must be a muscle.
not necessarily. I'm just saying that because of my background with Andrija, who is very, very critical about documenting these kinds of things, to me, it was important that I was really interested in people who could do it without touching them. That to me was a litmus test at the time. And now it's more prominent.
Right. So
that's do it.
And I can't imagine me doing it. But other scientists have sent this physicist to me saying, "We think Gail can do this." And I'm saying,
cool.
"I can do this, but I'll try." I'm always willing to try any experiment that I'm asked to be in. But this is at a distance. This is where a silk thread and a spiral piece of paper with marks on it will be hanging from a cylinder where no air or wind can get in there. And then I'm supposed to set up a camera so that it can film it while I'm in another room sending it to twirl. And I've never done this, so that's why I'm asking you if there's any tips you have to give me an idea. Am I supposed to be thinking about deceased people and asking the spirits to help me move it? Am I supposed to have an imagination thing with it? Am I just supposed to be in a quiet, blissful, mindless state? Or what info can you offer me on this? Because I've never taken a class in telekinesis.
Well, I think this is marvelous that you're doing it. That's, the kind of experiment I like to see, that it's triple blind like that.
Apparently it's successful in Russia, and that's why this person wants to replicate it.
Yeah, well, they're doing all kinds of things, but if it was me, I would just try to kind of, if you're using a fork or a spoon, did they tell you what you'd be using?
No, piece of paper. You take a piece of paper and make a spiral out of it. So when it hangs, you see it twirling like a little round piece of paper, and then it'll be a silk thread. But it won't be wind or anything affect it. It's an enclosed glass.
Okay, so we're not talking about metal.
No,
Okay,
paper.
okay. Interesting. Okay. Um, how do you describe these things in a way that makes sense? I would just become the paper. I don't know how to say it more simply than that.
Oh, no, no, that's very interesting. I mean, I hadn't even thought of that avenue. That's why I want to get your advice on this. I'm willing to try different things. So I understand. I understand when you were saying you as a child could go inside a tree or become so tiny that you were part of that. I know what
Right.
that feels like. I've gone inside the stems of a flower. So I know what that possibility is. So is that the kind of connection you're meaning to take to with the
Yeah.
paper?
Wrap yourself in it and become part of it. And
Okay.
then just move with it. I mean, that's one way to try. Yeah.
Okay.
And
I'm very
not so much from a physical standpoint, although that you can accent it doing that, but
mhm.
more you actually become it. It's a consciousness thing. You kind of merge into the cells of the paper, the physics of it. Get tiny, get really tiny, and go in there and explore.
I'm very appreciative of this. Listeners, I'm sorry we had a little sidetrack here, but I really need some quick info before I start this next experiment. I love doing these experiments for these different scientists, which I've been doing since 1998 continually, because I learn stuff about how I operate by doing the tasks that they ask, because then I find out I didn't know I could do those things. So I
Right.
don't know how to do telekinesis, but I'm going to give it a try, and I'll let the listeners know a couple of months from now what our results were.
I have a feeling you're going to be pretty good at it.
Well, I guess we'll have to see. So now this is the time where we've talked for about an hour and 10 minutes or so, and I'm wondering what else you would like to share with the audience. Any advice or any words of wisdom or any things about your book you would like. I would love if everyone would go out and get a copy today because I really found it fabulous, and you're a great writer, and it's a very very fast read, and it's a
It is.
page turn. I wanted to know the next one. We're not going to go into the stories, but she interacts with famous people. You'll get to find out in the book which famous ones she met, and they're ones of our childhood and teenage years that you'd be thrilled to meet them. I don't even want to mention all the rock stars she happened to come across. So I think you should read the book. That was, anyways, being a Woodstock person, that was great reading about all those different, I mean, we were living a similar time in our teenage
Yeah.
years. So let's our audience hear any advice or any words of wisdom or anything else you'd like to talk about before we end our show.
Um, I I I think what for myself, after all the different things I've been through and come back from, that I really value as far as my own qualities, my resilience, that is not to be underestimated. You don't have to be a rock star. You don't have to do that. But being resilient, being able to come back up from whatever hits you and maybe even blossom, go through that process and back out the other side. Believe in yourself enough to do that. You know, don't let the world smack you down. Just it happens. Things happen to you. I mean, I had someone try and kill me who I never knew, and out of nowhere and never got answers. And that was 24 when I was 24. Now I'm certainly not 24 anymore. And this was in the mid 70s, or late 70s. And so I think we underestimate our own ability to be resilient when things happen. And we look to other people to give us that reassurance, but it's inside you. And it's not egotistical to try and tap into that and make that a priority. I think that's very valuable. And when I look back on everything, I think to myself, wow, you came back from all that and look at you. You're doing okay. You moved on to other things and enjoyed them fully. And so to me, that is a valuable commodity to have in a person, in a life, particularly on this crazy planet we're on, where you never know what's coming. And you can regain your equilibrium. That's enough. You don't have to shine every time.
Well, that's beautiful and really, really good advice. And I know it's from your heart because I can feel it in mine when you're saying it. And having been resilient myself, it really resonates. So I want to
Good.
thank you. Journey of learning stories from other people about the things that have happened in their lives, because we can learn from others. Remember, share your stories so stories can heal. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Google, all sorts of other media platforms. So tune in, listen, and we look forward to hearing your comments. Have a wonderful week and have a very, very joyous day. Bye.